In the heart of Toronto, inside the dazzling arena of Lakewood Church, a widowed nurse searching for hope was about to see faith turned into confrontation. What started as a celebration of positivity and praise turned volatile when a global televangelist tried to challenge a living legend on what it means to follow Jesus. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical Hollywood guest. For over 60 years, he had been a martial arts master and former Air Force veteran, known for his unshakable calm and code of honor. When Joel Osteen pressed him to prove his faith before 16,000 people, the McGork didn't realize it was testing a man trained to fight without raising his voice. Chuck's silent defiance would shatter the illusion of spectacle, forcing even Osteen himself to face a truth no sermon had ever prepared him for. What began as a Sunday show about success and salvation would become a reckoning of humility and authenticity. The brightest church in America would never shine the same after one quiet man knelt and made the world listen without a word. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The lights of Lakewood Church blazed overhead like artificial stars, bathing the massive auditorium in a celestial glow. From her seat in the front row, Maria Alvarez felt both skeptical. The grand stage before her, polished to a mirror shine, framed by enormous LED screens and decorated with tasteful flower arrangements, looked more like a television set than a place of worship. Around her, 16,000 people murmured in anticipation, their collective energy creating a gentle roar that filled the converted basketball arena. Maria smoothed the wrinkles of her dress and checked her watch. It had been 6 months since Miguel's funeral. 6 months of night shifts at the hospital, of coming home to an empty apartment, praying for something, anything, to fill the void. Her coworker had suggested Lakewood. She'd said his positivity just lifts you up. Now, surrounded by excitement, Maria wasn't sure what she was looking for. Faith had always been something quiet in her family. Candles lit in small chapels, prayers whispered in her grandmother's kitchen. This felt different, spectacular, produced. Backstage, Joel Osteen stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting his tie with practiced fingers. At 51, his face remained boyishly handsome. Smooth skin, perfect teeth, hair immaculately styled. The powder blue suit he wore had been selected specifically for this broadcast. Research showed it conveyed both authority and approachability on camera. 2 minutes, Pastor Joel, called a voice from the doorway. Joel turned to see David Cho, his stage manager, clipboard in hand. A slender Korean American in his 30s, David had been with the ministry for 5 years, rising quickly through the production ranks. His efficiency kept the massive operation running smoothly. Thanks, David. Joel smiled, his voice carrying the same warm tenor that millions recognized. Is our special guest here yet? David nodded, tapping his headset. Mr. Norris arrived 10 minutes ago. He's in the green room. Very quiet. Perfect, Joel said, turning back to the mirror for one last check. This Faith in Action segment is going to be spectacular. The online numbers will be massive. David hesitated. Pastor, I should mention, Mr. Norris didn't seem interested in reviewing the talking points we sent over. He just nodded. A flicker of concern crossed Joel's face before dissolving into his trademark smile. That's fine. Sometimes the Holy Spirit works best through spontaneity. He straightened his shoulders. God's got this. Joel closed his eyes for a brief prayer, but opened one slightly to check his positioning under the vanity lights. Perfect. In the green room down the hall, Chuck Norris sat alone, his hands resting lightly on his knees. At 84, his body remained remarkably fit, the result of decades of disciplined martial arts training. He wore simple clothes, dark slacks, a button-up shirt, no tie. His weathered face, framed by silver-gray hair, appeared contemplative beneath his iconic beard. A production assistant had offered him coffee, water, a selection of snacks. He had politely declined everything except a glass of water, which sat untouched on the table beside him. A television mounted on the wall showed the service about to begin, but Chuck wasn't watching it. Instead, his eyes were closed, his breathing slow and measured. He hadn't planned on accepting the invitation to Lakewood. Celebrity appearances weren't something he sought anymore, but something about this particular request had tugged at him. A feeling he'd learned to recognize as guidance rather than coincidence. Mr. Norris. A young woman with a headset peered in. "We're ready for you. You'll be introduced after the worship segment?" Chuck nodded, rising smoothly to his feet. "Thank you." Out in the arena, the house lights dimmed. A reverent hush fell over the crowd as spotlights swept dramatically across the stage. Music swelled an orchestral backing track with a driving beat that made the floorboards vibrate. The crowd rose as one, applauding as Joel Osteen bounded onto the stage, arms wide, smile radiant. "Welcome to Lakewood," his amplified voice echoed. "This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it." The crowd erupted. Maria found herself standing with them, caught in the emotional current. Despite her reservations, she felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Maybe this was what she needed, something big enough to drown out grief. Joel moved across the stage with practiced ease, his gestures flowing naturally with his words. "Today is special. Today is powerful. Today, God has brought you here for a reason." In the production booth high above the audience, David watched the monitor displays, calling camera switches. "Camera 3, tight on Pastor Joel. Camera 2, pan the crowd reaction, ready for the scripture graphics." Joel's sermon opening flowed like a well-rehearsed symphony. He shared an anecdote about overcoming obstacles, smoothly transitioning to the Bible verses displayed on the massive screens. The message was uplifting, accessible. God wants you to prosper, to overcome, to rise above circumstances. 30 minutes in, Joel's pace changed subtly. He moved to center stage, his voice taking on a more intimate tone. "Today we have someone special joining us. A man who understands what it means to stand strong in faith and action." Joel's hands clasped together as he looked towards stage left. "Please welcome a true American icon, a man who has inspired millions through his talents, his charitable work, and his faith, Chuck Norris." The audience's reaction was immediate gasps, then thunderous applause. Phones rose in unison as people scrambled to capture the moment. Chuck emerged from the wings, walking with unhurried dignity, where Joel practically danced across the stage. Chuck moved with the measured grace of someone completely at peace with his space in the world. The two men met center stage. Joel's arm went around Chuck's shoulders as they shook hands. The contrast was striking. Joel's telegenic enthusiasm beside Chuck's weathered stillness. "What an honor," Joel said into his microphone, his voice carrying genuine excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Norris." Chuck nodded respectfully to the audience, his expression warm but reserved. Joel gestured to a pair of sleek armchairs positioned for their conversation. As they sat, Maria leaned forward in her seat. Suddenly more interested, it was something about the older man's presence that felt authentic in a way she couldn't immediately name. "Now," Joel said, crossing his legs and angling toward Chuck, "we've invited you as part of our Faith in Action series. Your life has been a testament to both. Tell us, how has faith guided your journey?" Chuck considered the question, his silence extending just long enough that Joel almost jumped to fill it. But then he spoke, his voice quiet yet carrying clear authority. "Faith isn't something I talk about much," Chuck said. "It's something I try to live." His simple answer hung in the air. Joel nodded enthusiastically, but Maria noticed a subtle shift in his expression, a momentary uncertainty. This wasn't going to be the polished back and forth he was accustomed to. From his position in the control booth, David felt a flicker of professional concern. Chuck's answers would be too short for the segment they had planned. He spoke into his headset. "Tell Pastor, we might need to extend the musical outro if this continues." On stage, Joel leaned forward with his practiced smile. "In living faith, that's what this ministry is all about. Your journey from martial arts champion to action star to philanthropist has inspired so many. Would you say strength and faith can walk hand in hand?" Chuck's eyes met Joel directly. "True strength serves, not shows." A murmur rippled through the crowd. In the front row, Maria felt something stir inside her recognition. She thought of Miguel, of how his quiet strength had manifested not in words, but in endless small acts of service. making coffee for night shift nurses, remembering birthdays, holding the hands of dying patients when their families couldn't be there. Joel's smile remained fixed, but something subtle changed in his posture. This wasn't the energetic exchange he'd envisioned. He glanced briefly at the audience, then at the camera positions, before turning back to Chuck with renewed vigor. Amen to that. And serving others is exactly what Jesus called us to do. Joel stood suddenly, pacing as he often did during emotional high points in his sermons. Chuck Norris. Ladies and gentlemen, a man who understands that faith without works is dead. The audience applauded on cue. Chuck remained seated, his expression unchanged, neither pleased nor displeased by the reaction. He simply watched Joel, a slight curiosity in his eyes. As if observing a natural phenomenon, Joel turned back toward his guest, the spotlights catching his perfect smile. But behind that smile, the first seeds of something unexpected had been planted. A confrontation neither man had planned, but both perhaps had been destined to face. The applause faded into an expectant hush. Joel Osteen circled back to his chair, but remained standing, microphone in hand. The familiar rhythm of his service had shifted ever so slightly, like a record with a subtle warp. The music still playing, but the timing just off enough to notice. You know, Joel continued, voice warm and engaging, when we talk about faith in action, we're really talking about the power to transform lives. He gestured expansively toward the audience. Everyone here today is facing something. A health challenge, a financial struggle, a relationship in need of healing. Faith gives us the strength to overcome. The crowd responded with scattered amens and applause. Joel's gaze swept over them, connecting, gathering energy. This was the dance he knew well, the building of emotional momentum, the careful orchestration of spiritual experience. Chuck Norris sat quietly, hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. His posture was relaxed but attentive, unlike Joel, who seemed to expand to fill the massive stage. Chuck appeared exactly his size, neither diminished by the spectacle nor attempting to dominate it. Joel turned toward him again. Chuck, you've inspired millions through your career. You've faced challengers in the ring and on screen. What would you say to someone watching today who feels overwhelmed by their circumstances? It was a softball question. An invitation to deliver an inspiring platitude that would fit perfectly into the service's message. But Chuck took a moment before answering, his expression thoughtful. Circumstances aren't enemies to be defeated, he said finally. Sometimes they're teachers to be respected. Again, the brevity and unexpected direction of his answer created a small pause in the flow. Joel's smile flickered for just a microsecond before reasserting itself. Powerful perspective. Joel recovered smoothly. God often uses our challenges to shape us, doesn't he? The Bible tells us that trials produce perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. In the control booth, David Cho frowned slightly at his monitors. The camera trained on Chuck showed a man listening respectfully, but not nodding or offering the affirmative responses that would make for good television. David touched his headset. Camera to widen, to include both subjects. Let's capture the contrast. Joel sensed the subtle tension and tried a different approach, injecting a lighthearted tone. Now I have to ask, and I'm sure many here are wondering, does Chuck Norris ever actually get nervous? The internet says you can kill fear just by staring it down. He chuckled, inviting the audience to join in. A few laughs rippled through the crowd, but Chuck didn't smile at the reference to the famous memes about his toughness. Instead, his expression grew more earnest. Fear is natural, he said. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. With faith, we're never alone in that journey. It was a sincere answer, one that carried the weight of a life actually lived rather than a script prepared. Several people in the audience murmured appreciatively, including Maria. She found herself leaning forward, drawn to the older man's unvarnished honesty. Joel nodded. But Maria noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor where he typically controlled every moment of his services with practiced ease. He now seemed slightly off balance, a dancer whose partner wasn't following the choreography. Let's talk about your personal faith journey. Joel pivoted, moving closer to Chuck. You're known as a man of strong Christian conviction. How do you share that faith with others? Chuck straightened slightly in his chair, the question seeming to touch something important to him. By trying to live it authentically, he said, words matter less than actions. In Matthew, Jesus says, we'll be known by our fruits, not our leaves. The biblical reference landed with an unexpected weight. Several people in the audience nodded in agreement. Joel paused, then laughed lightly. Well, I've been accused of having plenty of both leaves and fruits. The crowd chuckled, but not as uniformly as usual. Some were still processing Chuck's words, including Maria, who found herself thinking about the contrast between the quiet faith of her childhood and the spectacle surrounding her. Now, from his position backstage, watching on a monitor, a young assistant pastor whispered to a sound technician, "Is it just me, or is Chuck Norris low-key challenging Pastor Joel's whole approach?" The technician shrugged. "Man's barely said 30 words total." "Exactly," the assistant pastor replied. On stage, Joel seemed to sense the subtle shift in energy. His next question came with an edge barely concealed beneath his smile. "You've built a career in action, films, fighting, combat. How do you reconcile that with Christ's teachings about turning the other cheek?" The question hung in the air, its challenging nature obvious to everyone. In the front row, Maria felt her breath catch. The question wasn't just theological. It felt personal, almost accusatory. Chuck didn't immediately respond. He looked at Joel for a long moment, then surveyed the massive church. The light, cameras, the enormous screens, projecting their faces. When he finally spoke, his voice remained measured. "There's a difference between portraying conflict and seeking it," he said. "In my films, I often played characters who fought only when necessary, and usually to protect others." He paused. "But you raise a fair point. I've thought a lot about violence and faith. The conclusion I've reached is that strength carries responsibility. The stronger you are, the gentler you should be." The answer was neither defensive nor combative. Yet somehow it shifted the dynamic between the two men. Joel, standing in his tailored suit beneath professional lighting designed to highlight his every gesture, suddenly seemed less substantial next to Chuck's weathered authenticity. David, watching from the booth, muttered under his breath, "This isn't what we rehearsed." He checked the rundown sheet. They were already 8 minutes over the planned segment time, pushing into the closing worship set, but the tension on stage was palpable, the kind of genuine moment producers dream about capturing. He spoke into his headset. "Stay with this. Tell the worship team we're extending. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Joel paced a few steps, gathering himself. That's a beautiful perspective," he said. But his usual seamless delivery had developed a hairline fracture. He seemed to be calculating his next move carefully. In the audience, Maria found herself holding her breath. The conversation had moved beyond the usual inspirational platitudes into something real. Around her, she sensed others felt it too. A subtle leaning forward in seats, a collective intuition that something unscripted was unfolding. Joel stopped pacing and turned to face Chuck directly. "You know, that reminds me of something powerful," he said, voice gaining strength again. "David was a mighty warrior, yet God called him a man after his own heart. Strength and faith, they can absolutely coexist." He looked out at the congregation. "That's the message of Lakewood. We can be both successful and spiritual, both powerful and compassionate." The crowd applauded, responding to the familiar cadence of Joel's preaching. But Chuck's expression had changed subtly. A slight furrow in his brow, a thoughtful narrowing of his eyes. He was studying Joel now, seeing beyond the polished exterior to something underneath. Joel seemed to notice the scrutiny. He walked closer to Chuck, voice taking on an intimate quality despite being broadcast to thousands. "What I admire about you, Chuck, is your conviction. In Hollywood, in a culture that often mocks faith, you've stood strong. Tell us, how do you maintain that certainty in your beliefs when facing criticism?" The question seemed genuine, almost vulnerable. For the first time, Maria wondered if Joel himself wrestled with doubts behind his perpetual optimism. Chuck considered before answering. I don't claim certainty, he said finally. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting even when the path isn't clear. He paused. Humility is essential to faith. Without it, belief becomes brittle. The word humility lingered in the air like a challenge. Joel's smile remained in place, but something flashed behind his eyes. A momentary bristling that was gone almost before it registered. But Maria caught it. So did others. The atmosphere in the massive arena shifted imperceptibly, but definitely like air pressure changing before a storm. Joel took a half step back and gestured toward the audience. And that's why we're here every week, to walk this journey together, to learn and grow in faith. His voice carried the practiced uplift of a transition, the verbal equivalent of a musical bridge. Chuck Norris, ladies and gentlemen, sharing wisdom from a lifetime of faith and action. The audience applauded again, but it felt different now. A response born more from uncertainty than enthusiasm. They were witnessing something unfolding between the two men that wasn't in the program. Something subtle, but undeniable. Joel glanced off stage, then back to Chuck. Before we transition to our closing worship, I'd like to ask you one more question. He paused, seemingly weighing his words. In your view, what's the most important thing for Christians to remember in today's complex world? It was a broad question, one that could have been answered with a safe generality, but Chuck's gaze had grown more intent, as if he too sensed they had reached a critical juncture. Remember that faith isn't a performance, he said quietly. It's a relationship. The words were simple, but they fell like stones into still water. Ripples of murmurs spread through the crowd. On Maria's left, an elderly woman whispered, "Amen to that." On her right, a businessman in an expensive suit shifted uncomfortably. Joel stood motionless at center stage, microphone in hand, spotlight illuminating his face. For perhaps the first time in years of ministry, he seemed genuinely unsure of what to say next. The silence stretched 3 seconds, 5, 10, an eternity in broadcast terms. Then Joel's face transformed with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. A relationship? Absolutely, he exclaimed. A personal relationship with Jesus. That's the foundation of everything we teach here. He turned toward the audience, arms outstretched. And that relationship empowers us to become who God created us to be, victorious, prosperous, fulfilled. But something had changed. The polished veneer had cracked, revealing glimpses of something raw underneath. As Joel launched into what was clearly a pivot toward the service's conclusion, Chuck remained seated, watching thoughtfully. He hadn't raised his voice or made accusations. Somehow his quiet presence had become a silent challenge to everything around him. In the control booth, David whispered to his assistant, "Something's happening down there." The assistant nodded. "Pastor seems rattled. Keep all cameras live," David instructed. "Whatever's coming next, we need to capture it." The atmosphere in Lakewood Church had shifted, like weather changing, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Joel Osteen maintained his smile. But tension had crept into his shoulders. Visible to those watching closely, the practiced rhythm of his movements had acquired a slight mechanical quality, as if he were suddenly conscious of each gesture. "Let's talk about influence," Joel said, recovering his momentum. He was no stranger to difficult interviews over the years. He'd faced skeptical journalists and hostile critics. This was his house, his stage, his congregation. Now, God has given you a platform, Chuck. Millions know your name. How do you view that responsibility? Chuck nodded thoughtfully. With concern, honestly, he replied, influence can become intoxicating. The spotlight can distort perspective. Joel's laugh was light, diplomatic. I don't know about that. I think when God blesses us with influence, it's because he trusts us to use it for his purposes. He gestured expansively at the arena around them, like this ministry reaching millions with a message of hope. Chuck didn't immediately respond. His expression remained respectful but unreadable. As he glanced around at the elaborate production, the multiple camera operators, the sophisticated lighting rigs, the enormous LED screens displaying their conversation in real time, In the front row, Maria Alvarez felt a strange tension gathering in her chest. She had come seeking comfort, some balm for her grief, but instead found herself witnessing something unexpected. A quiet collision of worldviews happening beneath the surface of polite conversation. Joel seemed to sense Chuck's unspoken assessment. He said, voice taking on a more deliberate tone. There are different ways to spread God's message. Some are called to quiet service, others to public ministry. He smiled broadly at the audience. Lakewood reaches people who might never set foot in a traditional church. That's true, Chuck acknowledged. The question is, what message they receive when they come. The simple statement landed with surprising weight. A murmur rippled through sections of the audience. Joel's smile flickered momentarily before reasserting itself with professional smoothness. Our message is straight from Scripture, Joel replied, a defensive edge creeping into his voice despite his smile. Hope, redemption, God's favor, the good news. He took a few steps toward center stage as if physically reclaiming the space. In fact, let me share something I think everyone needs to hear today. He was transitioning into familiar territory, his inspirational preaching mode. But Chuck's presence had somehow changed the context. As Joel launched into a well-practiced segment about overcoming obstacles through faith, Maria noticed how differently it registered now. The words that might have seemed uplifting 15 minutes ago suddenly felt performative, more focused on emotional effect than substance. In the control booth, David Cho watched with growing concern. The camera trained on Joel showed a man working harder than usual to maintain his composure, and the camera on Chuck revealed someone listening attentively but not nodding along. David touched his headset. Camera 3. Get me a wide shot of the audience. I want to see their reaction to this. The monitor showed a congregation in subtle discord, some leaning forward in rapt attention to Joel, others watching Chuck with curious expressions, still others exchanging glances with their neighbors. The unified response that typically characterized Lakewood services had fractured. Joel concluded his impromptu sermon segment with practiced flair, receiving applause that seemed slightly less enthusiastic than usual. Turned back to Chuck, who had remained seated throughout. Chuck, Joel said, voice taking on a challenging edge barely concealed beneath his smile. You've been unusually quiet about your faith over the years, at least publicly. Some might wonder, is faith something we should keep private, or are we called to declare it boldly? The question hung in the air, its subtext clear to everyone. Joel was questioning whether Chuck's reserved approach reflected a deeper spiritual timidity. In the front row, Maria felt her breath catch. The question wasn't just theological, it felt personal, almost accusatory. Chuck didn't immediately respond. He looked at Joel for a long moment, then surveyed the massive church, the lights, cameras, the enormous screens projecting their faces. When he finally spoke, his voice remained measured. Jesus had harsh words for those who pray on street corners to be seen. He said simply, "Faith isn't measured by volume." The statement wasn't delivered with hostility, yet it landed like a gentle rebuke. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded in agreement. The division was becoming more apparent. Joel's smile remained fixed, but a flush crept up from his collar. Scripture also tells us not to hide our light under a bushel, he countered, voice rising slightly. We're called to be bold in our witness, to shout from the mountaintops. Bold doesn't have to mean loud, Chuck replied. Sometimes the strongest statements are the quietest ones. The contrast between the two men had never been more stark. Joel in constant motion, voice modulating for emotional effect. Chuck still speaking sparingly, but with unexpected impact. David, watching from the booth, muttered, "This is turning into a theological showdown." Joel paced across the stage, gathering himself. When he turned back, his expression had hardened slightly beneath his smile. He said, his tone conversational, but with an edge. "I've always admired how you've stood for traditional values in Hollywood. But I've wondered, does that stance sometimes create conflict with those who don't share those values?" It was a pivot, an attempt to move Chuck onto safer territory, but also a subtle jab suggesting that Chuck's faith might be more about conservative politics than spiritual depth. Chuck's eyes narrowed slightly. The first sign that Joel's words had registered as something beyond casual conversation. "My relationship with God isn't political," he said, and treating others with respect isn't at odds with personal conviction. Of course. Of course. Joel nodded quickly. But surely there are times when we must take a stand. When we must declare where we stand on moral issues. Isn't boldness part of faith? Something shifted in Chuck's demeanor? Not anger, but a more focused intensity. Like a martial artist sensing the beginning of a true engagement. Boldness and volume aren't the same thing, he said. Jesus spoke softly to the woman at the well, but confronted the money changers directly. Discernment matters more than decib. In the audience, a man called out, "Amen." Others nodded. Maria found herself among them, surprised by how strongly Chuck's words resonated. She thought of Miguel again, how he had lived his faith through quiet acts of kindness, never once standing on a stage or broadcasting his beliefs. Joel seemed to register the audience's reaction. His smile tightened. "Let me be direct, Chuck," he said, dropping some of his customary diplomacy. "You've built your career on action, on conflict films where the hero vanquishes enemies through force. Some might see a contradiction between that and Christ's teachings on peace and turning the other cheek. How do you reconcile those things?" The question hung in the air, its challenging nature obvious to everyone. David winced in the control booth. He's going after Chuck Norris. Bold strategy. Chuck remained composed, but his gaze intensified. "There's a difference between portraying conflict and seeking it," he said. "My films, I often played characters who fought only when necessary, usually to protect others." He paused. "But you raise a fair point. I've thought a lot about violence and faith. The conclusion I've reached is that strength carries responsibility. The stronger you are, the gentler you should be." The answer was neither defensive nor combative. Yet somehow it shifted the dynamic between the two men. Joel, standing in his tailored suit beneath professional lighting designed to highlight his every gesture, suddenly seemed less substantial next to Chuck's weathered authenticity. Joel's expression flickered with something that might have been frustration or uncertainty. He glanced briefly off stage as if looking for guidance, then back at Chuck. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new intensity. "Let me ask you something, Chuck. If you truly believe in what you're saying, that authentic faith is quiet, unassuming, then why agree to appear on this stage? Why come to one of the largest churches in America with cameras broadcasting to millions? Isn't there a contradiction there?" The question was direct, almost confrontational. A collective intake of breath swept through the audience. Maria felt her heartbeat quicken. This wasn't the inspirational service she had expected. It had become something raw, unscripted, and far more compelling. Chuck looked at Joel steadily. "I came because I was invited," he said simply, "and because sometimes quiet truth needs to be spoken in loud places." The statement wasn't delivered as an attack, yet it landed with unmistakable force. A murmur rippled through the congregation. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others nodded in agreement. The unity of the audience had fully fractured now, revealing the complexity beneath the surface. Joel stood motionless for a moment, processing Chuck's words. When he moved again, there was a new tension in his stride. He circled Chuck's chair like a prosecutor approaching a witness. Microphone gripped tightly in his hand. "If you truly live by faith," Joel said, voice rising with each word, "show us what that looks like right here, right now. The Bible says faith without works is dead. What works would you point to that demonstrate your faith is alive?" It was a challenge, plain and simple, a demand for Chuck to justify himself before thousands. The congregation fell silent. Even the production crew seemed frozen. Cameras locked on the two figures at center stage. In the front row, Maria found herself holding her breath. The question felt deeply unfair, yet also strangely necessary. As if something important hung in the balance of how it would be answered. Chuck looked up at Joel, then slowly around at the vast audience, watching expectant silence. For the first time, a smile, small but genuine, touched the corners of his mouth. Without a word, he placed his hands on the arms of his chair and rose to his feet. Chuck Norris stood at center stage, the spotlight casting his shadow long across the polished floor. For a man in his 80s, he moved with remarkable fluidity. No hesitation, no stiffness, just the earned grace of a lifetime of disciplined movement. Joel Osteen watched him rise, microphone still gripped in his hand, smile frozen in place. The challenge he'd issued hung in the air between them. Show us what faith looks like right here, right now. It had been meant to reassert control, to place Chuck in a defensive position. But something in Chuck's calm demeanor suggested the dynamic had shifted. The vast auditorium had fallen silent. 16,000 people watched, breath collectively held. In the front row, Maria Alvarez leaned forward, pulse quickening. The elderly woman beside her whispered, "What's he doing?" Chuck stood quietly for a moment, surveying the massive church, the cameras, the lights, the enormous screens displaying his face. Then, without speaking, he turned toward Joel and extended his hand. The gesture was simple, an invitation to shake hands. Joel hesitated, caught off guard by the understated response. After a moment, he stepped forward and took Chuck's hand. His camera-ready smile still in place, but uncertainty evident in his eyes. Chuck clasped Joel's hand firmly. But instead of just shaking it, he placed his other hand on Joel's shoulder and leaned in to speak quietly. Too quietly for the microphone to catch. For several seconds, he spoke into Joel's ear, his expression earnest. The audience strained to hear. The camera operators zoomed in, trying to capture the moment. In the control booth, David Cho frantically adjusted audio levels. But Chuck's words remained private, meant only for Joel. As Chuck spoke, remarkable transformation crossed Joel's face. His practiced smile faltered, then disappeared completely. His eyes widened slightly, then focused with new intensity. When Chuck finally stepped back, still holding Joel's hand in his, Joel looked different. Somehow less like a polished presenter and more like a man encountering something unexpected and profound. For a long moment, they stood together in silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, Chuck did something else. He turned away from Joel and walked to the very edge of the stage. There he looked out at the audience, his gaze moving slowly across the faces before him. When he reached the front row, his eyes met Maria's briefly. She felt seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and deeply moving. As if this stranger had somehow recognized something in her that she herself had been struggling to articulate. Her eyes welled with unexpected tears. Chuck turned away from the audience and looked around at the elaborate stage. He took in the massive LED screens, the sophisticated lighting rigs, the production crew scrambling to follow this unscripted moment. Then, with deliberate movements, he walked back to center stage. What he did next left the entire church speechless. Chuck Norris, martial arts champion, action star, cultural icon, knelt down on one knee at center stage. He bowed his head and closed his eyes. His hands came together, not dramatically, but naturally in the simple posture of prayer. He said nothing, made no pronouncement, offered no explanation. The silence that followed was profound. 16,000 people watching a man pray without words, without performance, without any apparent awareness of the spectacle around him. Maria felt something catch in her throat. The elderly woman beside her whispered, "Oh my," and reached for her hand. Across the aisle, a businessman who had been checking his phone throughout the service slowly put it away. On stage, Joel stood frozen, microphone still in hand. His expression cycled through confusion, discomfort, and something harder to define, perhaps recognition. He looked uncertainly toward the production booth, but no guidance came. This moment had moved beyond the carefully planned program into something unscripted and raw. In the control booth, David Cho watched transfixed. "Stay on him," he whispered to the camera operators. Wide shot of the audience reaction. "Get me Pastor Joel's face." The monitors showed a congregation transformed. Some confused, many moved, all utterly engaged. Seconds stretched into a full minute. Chuck remained kneeling, absolutely still. The silence deepened, becoming almost tangible, a presence rather than an absence. In that silence, the elaborate production surrounding them, the lights, cameras, screens, sound system began to seem oddly superfluous, like ornate framing around a painting that needed no embellishment. Finally, Joel moved. He took a step toward Chuck, then hesitated. The microphone in his hand seemed to have become a foreign object. He looked at it as if unsure what it was for. After a moment's consideration, he set it down carefully on a nearby surface. The small sound it made, a gentle tap, echoed through the silent arena. Then Joel Osteen, pastor of America's largest church, did something no one expected. He walked to where Chuck knelt and quietly knelt beside him. A murmur rippled through the congregation, not disapproval, but surprise and something deeper. Maria found tears streaming down her face without fully understanding why. Around her, others were similarly affected. The businessman across the aisle had bowed his head. The young couple behind her held hands tightly. From the back of the auditorium, someone began to sing. The voice was untrained, but sincere, offering a simple hymn, Amazing Grace. Within seconds, another voice joined. Then another. The sounds swelled organically without instrumental accompaniment, without direction, just human voices joining together in recognition of something genuine unfolding before them. Chuck remained kneeling, eyes closed, seemingly unaware of the impact his simple gesture had created. Beside him, Joel knelt with his head bowed, hands clasped, but his face betrayed inner conflict. A man wrestling with something profound? In the control booth, David watched through watery eyes. He had produced hundreds of services, managed countless emotional moments designed to inspire and uplift. But this was different, unplanned, unproduced, and somehow more real than anything he'd ever captured on camera. "This is it," he whispered to his assistant. "This is what it's actually supposed to be about." After what seemed both an eternity and no time at all, Chuck opened his eyes and rose smoothly to his feet. He extended a hand to Joel, who took it and stood beside him. The singing from the congregation continued, filling the vast space with harmonic simplicity. Chuck looked at Joel with an expression of profound kindness. Not triumph, not judgment, just compassionate recognition of a shared humanity. Joel met his gaze, and for perhaps the first time that day, his expression was entirely unguarded, vulnerable, uncertain, genuine. Chuck turned toward the audience. He made no grand gesture, offered no dramatic statement. He simply nodded once, acknowledging their presence with quiet respect. Then he turned and walked toward the side of the stage. His exit as understated as his demonstration had been. Joel remained at center stage, watching Chuck leave. The microphone lay where he had placed it. The teleprompters displayed the next segment of the service. The words waiting to be spoken, the production team hovered in the wings, unsure whether to proceed with the program or follow this unexpected detour. In that moment of uncertainty, Joel Osteen faced a choice that would define not just this service, but potentially his entire ministry. He could return to the script, reclaim control of the narrative, steer the service back toward familiar territory. Or he could acknowledge that something profound and unplanned had occurred. Something that perhaps held more truth than all his carefully crafted messages combined. As the singing gradually faded, all eyes turned to Joel. The silence that followed carried a question that everyone, the congregation, the production team, perhaps even Joel himself, was waiting to hear answered. Joel Osteen stood alone at center stage, the absence of his microphone suddenly conspicuous. For a man who had spent decades filling spaces with his voice, the silence felt foreign, almost physical in its presence. Behind him, Chuck Norris had disappeared into the wings, leaving no trace except the lingering impact of his simple demonstration. The congregation waited, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Some still had tears on their faces. Others looked confused, but engaged. All were watching Joel with an intensity rarely directed at even his most passionate sermons. In the front row, Maria wiped her eyes, her grief momentarily forgotten in the wake of witnessing something that felt like authentic spiritual connection. Joel looked out at the sea of faces, then glanced toward the production booth. No guidance came. The teleprompter still displayed his planned closing remarks. Uplifting phrases about victory and blessing that suddenly seemed hollow against what had just transpired. The carefully constructed framework of the service had been disrupted by something simpler and more profound. He took a step forward, then stopped for the first time in memory. Joel Osteen appeared genuinely uncertain of what to say. The realization seemed to pass visibly across his face. He was a man accustomed to knowing exactly what came next, to controlling the emotional flow of every service. Now, he stood exposed, script abandoned, persona temporarily set aside. In the control booth, David Cho watched intently. "Stay with Pastor Joel," he instructed the camera operators. "Whatever happens next, we need to capture it." Joel took a deep breath, squared his shoulders as if preparing to reclaim control, then did something unexpected. He walked to where his microphone lay and left it there. Instead of picking it up, he moved to the very edge of the stage and sat down, letting his legs dangle over the side like a child might. A murmur of surprise rippled through the congregation. This wasn't the polished, perfect Joel Osteen they were accustomed to seeing. This was something else, a man seemingly stripped of performance, reaching for something genuine. "I don't know what to say," Joel admitted, his voice carrying naturally in the hushed arena. The words were simple but shocking, coming from someone known for never being at a loss for words. "I had a plan for today's message. I always have a plan." A small, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "Those who know me well know I like things to be perfect." A knowing chuckle ran through parts of the audience, breaking some of the tension. Joel nodded, acknowledging the truth of it, but what we just witnessed wasn't in the program. He glanced toward the wings where Chuck had exited. "Chuck Norris didn't say much today, did he?" But somehow he said everything. Joel looked down at his hands, then back up at the congregation. His expression had changed. The permanent smile replaced by something more contemplative, more real. "I've spent my life telling people about faith," he continued, "using the best words I can find, the most inspiring stories, the most uplifting messages. I still believe that hope is powerful, that positivity matters, but maybe." He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its practiced modulation, revealing a more natural cadence beneath. "Maybe sometimes all our words get in the way of the thing itself. Maybe faith isn't always about what we say, but about how we listen, how we humble ourselves." He gestured around at the elaborate stage. "How we remember what's essential when everything gets very big." In the front row, Maria felt something shift inside her, a recognition. The words Joel was speaking now seemed to come from somewhere different than his usual polished performance. There was vulnerability in them, a questioning that resonated with her own spiritual doubts. Joel stood up and walked slowly across the stage. No longer the confident figure commanding the space, but a man working through something in real time. "Chuck reminded me of something I think I've forgotten. He said that silence can be sacred, that sometimes the strongest statement is made without words." He stopped at center stage and looked up at the elaborate lighting rig, the massive LED screens, the sophisticated sound system. For a moment, he seemed to be seeing it all through new eyes. "All of this," he gestured expansively, "it's meant to help spread a message to reach people who need hope, who need God. That's always been my intention." His voice grew quieter. "But I wonder if sometimes the messenger starts believing the production is the message. If I've started believing that," a collective intake of breath swept through the auditorium. This level of self-reflection was unprecedented from the unfailingly positive pastor. In the control booth, David sat forward in his chair, transfixed. "I want to try something," Joel said. He walked to the edge of the stage and gestured to the production team. "Can we turn off the screens and the spotlights just for a moment?" The request was so contrary to everything Lakewood Productions stood for that there was a hesitation. Joel waited patiently. After a few seconds, the enormous LED screens went dark. Then, gradually, the theatrical lighting dimmed until only basic illumination remained. The transformation was remarkable. The cavernous space suddenly felt more intimate, more like a gathering than a spectacle. Joel nodded his thanks to the unseen technicians. "That's better," he said, his voice carrying naturally without amplification. "Now we can see each other." In the subdued lighting, the congregation seemed to come into clearer focus. Not a mass of anonymous faces, but individuals with distinct expressions, reactions, needs. Joel looked out at them with new attentiveness. He said, "Not just for being our guest, but for reminding all of us what faith looks like when it's stripped of performance, when it's just authentic." He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. The vulnerability in his expression was striking a man accustomed to certainty, now navigating doubt in real time. I've always believed that my calling was to lift people up, to inspire, to focus on the positive. I still believe that his voice gained strength, not from performance, but from conviction. But maybe I've been so focused on the message that I've forgotten something essential about the messenger, about humility, about silence. In the front row, Maria found herself nodding around her. Others were similarly engaged, leaning forward, expressions intent. The atmosphere had transformed from entertainment to communion. Joel walked back to center stage. His posture different now, less the confident showman, more the fellow seeker. "The truth is," he said, "I don't have all the answers." "I never did." A small genuine smile crossed his face. "That might be surprising to hear me say given how many books I've written telling people how to live their best life." A gentle laugh rippled through the congregation. Not mockery, but recognition. Joel nodded, acknowledging it. "Faith isn't a performance," he continued, echoing Chuck's earlier words. "It's a relationship, a journey. Sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, sometimes full of certainty. Sometimes," he gestured vaguely, searching for words. "Sometimes full of questions that don't have easy answers," he finished. "And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's where real growth happens." He fell silent, the absence of words filling the space with unexpected power. For perhaps 30 seconds in eternity, in a venue accustomed to constant stimulation, no one spoke. The congregation sat in collective stillness, experiencing something rare in the modern world. Shared silence. Finally, Joel spoke again, his voice quiet but clear. "I think we should end today's service differently than planned. Instead of a big production number, instead of me telling you what to think or feel, let's just take a few minutes of silence together to reflect, to listen." He sat down, cross-legged at center stage, a position that would have seemed utterly out of character an hour before. No agenda, no performance, just presence. In the control booth, David watched in amazement as 16,000 people settled into voluntary silence. No coughing, no shuffling, no whispered conversations, just collective stillness. On his monitor, he could see Joel sitting quietly, eyes closed. Not in the theatrical pose of prayer often adopted for cameras, but in genuine contemplation. David touched his headset. "Wide shot," he whispered to the camera operators. "Capture this moment." The silence extended 1 minute, 2, 3. Some in the audience bowed their heads. Others looked around in wonder at the unusual experience. In the front row, Maria closed her eyes, feeling something settle in her heart. Not an answer to her grief, but perhaps a different way of holding it. After 5 full minutes, Joel opened his eyes and looked out at the congregation. His expression was changed softer, more present. The performance aspect temporarily set aside. He rose to his feet with simple dignity. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for that gift of shared silence." He paused. "I think we found something important there. Something I want to explore more in the weeks ahead." He gestured toward the wings. "I want to thank Chuck Norris one more time, though he's already left the stage. His demonstration of faith through action, through presence rather than performance. It's given me a lot to think about. I hope it's done the same for you." Joel walked to the edge of the stage, closer to the congregation than he typically stood. "We'll close differently today. No big final song, no dramatic ending, just this moment of connection. Please take what you've experienced today and reflect on it. I know I will be." With that, he simply nodded, turned, and walked off stage. Not with his usual confident stride, but with the measured steps of a man carrying something new and still being understood. As the house lights came up, the congregation sat in stunned silence for several seconds before gradually beginning to move. Unlike the usual energetic exodus, people rose slowly, many turning to speak quietly with those around them. The atmosphere was subdued but electric. The shared recognition that they had witnessed something authentic and unexpected. In the front row, Maria remained seated as others began to file out. The elderly woman beside her touched her arm gently. "Are you all right, dear?" Maria nodded, surprised to find herself smiling through tears. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." She had come seeking distraction from grief and found instead a reminder that faith could be quiet, could be real, could exist in the spaces between words rather than in the noise. It wasn't an answer to her loss, but somehow it felt like a step towards something healing. As she finally rose to leave, Maria glanced back at the empty stage. Stripped now of its spectacle, returned to simple wood and space. In that emptiness, something profound had happened. Not a performance of faith, but faith itself, quiet, unassuming, and more powerful for its simplicity. Monday morning dawned clear and bright over Houston. At Lakewood Church, the weekend services were typically followed by production meetings, staff gathering to review footage, discuss what worked, plan improvements for the next broadcast. But today's meeting had been unexpectedly canceled. Instead, a simple email had gone out to all staff, taking a day for reflection. Services to resume next Sunday with some changes, details to follow. Joel, the unusual communication had sparked speculation among the staff. In the church's expansive administrative wing, whispered conversations filled the hallways. No one quite knew what to make of yesterday's service or Joel's uncharacteristic departure from script. David Cho sat alone in the empty production booth, reviewing footage from the previous day. On his monitor, he watched the moment when Chuck Norris had knelt in silent prayer, followed by Joel's unexpected vulnerability. The images were compelling, raw, authentic, powerful in their simplicity. His phone buzzed with a text from the assistant production manager. CNN wants footage from yesterday. What should I tell them? David stared at the message, considering the world would be interested in what had happened. Joel Osteen apparently humbled on his own stage, departing from his usual message of unfailing positivity. It could be framed as controversy, as failure, but that wasn't what David had witnessed. He had seen something far more meaningful. Genuine transformation unfolding in real time. Before he could reply, the door to the booth opened. Joel Osteen entered quietly, dressed casually in jeans and an untucked button-down shirt, a stark contrast to his usual suits. His expression was thoughtful, his trademark smile absent but not replaced by negativity. He simply looked present. "Morning, David," he said, taking a seat beside the production manager. "Pastor Joel," David acknowledged somewhat awkwardly. He gestured at his monitor. "I was just reviewing yesterday's service." Joel nodded, eyes fixed on the screen. "So was I. Couldn't sleep much last night. Kept thinking about it." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the footage play. On screen, Joel was sitting at the edge of the stage, speaking with unusual candor about his uncertainty. "Should I have cut the feed?" David asked finally. The question that had been weighing on him when things went off script. Joel shook his head slowly. "No, you did exactly right." He paused. "What happened yesterday needed to happen, needed to be seen. The networks are requesting footage," David said hesitantly. "People are talking about it online. It's starting to go viral." A small re-smile touched Joel's lips. "I'll bet it is." He leaned back in his chair, eyes still on the monitor. "Let them have it. All of it unedited." David looked at him in surprise. Lakewood productions were always carefully curated, edited for maximum impact, for perfect messaging. "Are you sure?" "I am," Joel replied simply. "For the first time in a while, I'm actually sure about something." He met David's gaze directly. What happened yesterday wasn't a PR problem to manage. It was a moment of truth. Maybe people need to see that. David nodded slowly, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I felt that too," he admitted. "It was different from our usual services. More real somehow." "Yes," Joel agreed. "More real." He looked thoughtful. "That's what I want to talk to you about. Actually, I'm considering some changes to our approach to all of this." He gestured around the sophisticated production booth with its multiple monitors, controls, and equipment. "What kind of changes?" David asked carefully. Joel seemed to choose his words with deliberation so different from his usual rapid-fire certainty. "More substance, less spectacle," he said finally. "More conversation, less performance, more authenticity, less," he gestured vaguely, "less production." David absorbed this, trying to understand the implications. You want to scale things back? Not exactly. Joel said, I still believe in reaching people, in using technology to spread a message of hope, but I want the messenger me to get out of the way more, to create space for something genuine to happen. He smiled slightly like it did yesterday. Chuck Norris hardly said anything, David observed, but somehow he said everything. Exactly, Joel nodded. That's what I can't stop thinking about. He didn't need a script or special effects, just presence, authenticity. He looked at David directly. When was the last time I went off script, David? When was the last time I said something that wasn't carefully crafted for maximum appeal? David didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. That's what needs to change, Joel said firmly. Starting next Sunday. David considered the logistical challenges of what Joel was suggesting. The production team will need guidance. We've built everything around a certain format. I know, Joel acknowledged. It won't be easy, but what happened yesterday, it felt like a wake-up call. Like I've been sleepwalking through my own ministry. He rubbed his eyes and David realized the pastor looked tired not just from lack of sleep, but from something deeper. All these years I've been so focused on inspiring people that I forgot what it means to be inspired, to be challenged, to grow. David nodded, understanding dawning. Chuck didn't come to be part of our show. No, Joel agreed. He came to be himself, and somehow that was more powerful than anything we could have scripted. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the massive auditorium below. I've built a career on positive messages, David, on making faith feel accessible and uplifting. I still believe in that. But yesterday showed me that sometimes the most powerful message isn't about feeling good. It's about being real. Across town, in a modest apartment filled with photographs and mementos of a life shared, Maria Alvarez prepared for her nursing shift. She moved with purpose. A subtle but definite shift from the mechanical motions that had carried her through the days since Miguel's death. The previous night, she had slept deeply for the first time in months. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but something had changed in how she held it. The unexpected service at Lakewood had touched something in her, awakened a recognition that faith could exist in silence as well as in celebration. As she pinned her nurse's badge to her uniform, her phone chimed with a notification. A video clip from yesterday's service had been posted online and was rapidly gaining views. Maria hesitated, then pressed play. The clip showed Chuck Norris kneeling in silent prayer, followed by Joel Osteen's unexpected vulnerability. The comments below ranged from confused to deeply moved, with many people expressing surprise at seeing the typically polished pastor in a moment of genuine uncertainty. Maria set down her phone, oddly reluctant to see the experience reduced to viral content. What had happened in that room had felt sacred, not spectacular. The stillness, the silence, the sense of something authentic breaking through the performance. These weren't easily captured in shareable clips. She finished preparing for work, slipping her husband's wedding ring onto a chain around her neck as she always did. But today, as she touched the smooth metal, she found herself speaking to him in the quiet of their apartment. I think I found something yesterday, Miguel, she said softly. Not answers, but space. Space to hold the questions. The words felt right, though they wouldn't have made sense to her before yesterday's service. She had gone to Lakewood, seeking distraction, spectacle, easy answers to impossible questions. Instead, she had witnessed a moment of genuine transformation, not just in Joel Osteen, but in herself. She thought about faith differently now. Miguel had never been a churchgoer in the traditional sense. His spirituality had expressed itself in quiet acts of service. Staying late with dying patients when their families couldn't be there, remembering the names of hospital custodians, bringing coffee to night shift nurses who weren't even on his floor. He had lived his faith through actions, not words. Perhaps that was why Chuck's silent demonstration had resonated so deeply with her. It had reminded her of Miguel, of substance over spectacle, of authenticity over performance. The realization didn't lessen her grief, but somehow it made it more meaningful. Connecting her loss to something larger than herself, Maria glanced at the clock and realized she needed to leave for her shift. As she locked her apartment door, she felt a subtle but definite shift in her perspective. Not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet certainty that faith could be found in the spaces between words, in the silence beneath the noise. Across Houston, similar conversations were happening. Those who had attended the service spoke of it with a kind of wonder, trying to articulate what had made it different from the usual polished productions. The word authentic kept emerging. Authentic moment, authentic emotion, authentic faith. At a small cafe near Rice University, the elderly woman who had sat beside Maria in the front row was having breakfast with her husband of 50 years. "I've never seen anything like it at Lakewood," she told him, stirring her tea thoughtfully. Joel Osteen actually admitted he didn't have all the answers in that silence. She shook her head in wonder. 16,000 people, and you could have heard a pin drop? Her husband, a retired theology professor, looked skeptical. One moment of humility doesn't change a ministry built on prosperity, gospel, and emotional manipulation, he said mildly. The woman considered this, then shrugged. Maybe not, she conceded. But it felt like the beginning of something. A crack in the facade, at least. "You've been trying to get me to attend that church for years," he reminded her with a small smile. "Now you've finally got my attention, though not for the reasons you expected." She reached across the table and patted his hand. "That's the thing about faith, isn't it? It rarely comes to us in the ways we expect." In the hospital where Maria worked, the morning shift was beginning. As she checked patient charts at the nurses' station, a colleague approached the same one who had recommended Lakewood Church months ago. "I saw a clip from yesterday's service," the colleague said, leaning against the counter. "Was that as intense in person as it looked online?" Maria considered the question. "More so," she said finally. "There was something in the room that can't be captured on video." "A kind of shared recognition of what?" her colleague asked, genuinely curious. Maria paused, organizing medication for her first patient. "That sometimes the loudest voice isn't the one with the most to say," she replied. "That faith can be quiet and still be powerful." She smiled slightly. "It reminded me of Miguel, actually." Her colleague's expression softened. "I can see that." She said he never needed to make a big show of anything. He just did what was right. Quietly, she tilted her head. "And you think that's what this Chuck Norris was demonstrating?" "I think so." Maria nodded. Though it wasn't just about him. It was about what happened when his authenticity collided with Joel Osteen's performance. She shrugged, struggling to articulate the experience. "It's hard to explain, but something real happened in that moment." The morning progressed across the city, people going about their routines, lives intersecting in the complex choreography of urban existence. But in various ways, the ripples from Sunday's service continued to spread. In his spacious office at Lakewood, Joel Osteen sat at his desk, a legal pad before him. The page was filled with notes, crossed-out phrases, questions, unusual for a man known for his ready answers and polished responses. He was drafting a message to his congregation, attempting to articulate something that was still taking shape in his own understanding. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His executive assistant entered, looking somewhat apprehensive. "Sorry to disturb you, Pastor, but there's a call I thought you might want to take." She hesitated. "It's Chuck Norris." Joel looked up in surprise. "Put him through," he said, reaching for his phone. When the line connected, there was a brief silence before Chuck's distinctive voice came through. "Joel," he said simply. "Chuck." Joel replied, "I've been wanting to thank you for yesterday." "No need for thanks," Chuck said. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing with everything." Joel considered the question, not the prefunctor. "How are you?" Of casual conversation, but a genuine inquiry about his state of mind after such a profound public moment. "I'm processing," he admitted. "What happened yesterday, what you showed us, it's made me rethink some things." "That's good," Chuck said. "Questioning is part of faith." "Yes," Joel agreed. The concept's still new to him. "I think it is." He paused. "You know, when you knelt down like that, when you prayed without words, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" Chuck asked quietly. Joel leaned back in his chair, trying to articulate something still forming. That sometimes the most powerful statement is made in silence. That faith can be found in the spaces between words. Yes, Chuck said simply. The things you whispered to me on stage, Joel continued. About humility being the soil where faith grows strongest. About how truth doesn't need amplification. He shook his head in wonder. How did you know those were exactly the words I needed to hear? I didn't, Chuck admitted. I just spoke what felt true in that moment. Another silence fell between them, not awkward but contemplative. I'm making some changes, Joel said finally. To the ministry, to our approach. Less spectacle, more substance, less performance, more...
Ow.
He searched for the word. More presence. That takes courage, Chuck observed. Changing course in front of millions. Maybe, Joel acknowledged. But it would take more courage to continue as before, knowing what I know now. He paused. Would you consider coming back? Not as a guest, but as a guide. Maybe someone to help me navigate this transition. Chuck's soft chuckle came through the line. I think you've already found your guide, Joel. The same one that's available to all of us. You just need to keep listening. Pause. But I'm happy to talk anytime. Joel felt a curious mixture of disappointment and understanding. Thank you, he said sincerely, for everything. Faith isn't a destination, Chuck said. It's a journey. Be patient with yourself as you walk it. After they disconnected, Joel sat quietly for a long moment. Then he turned back to his legal pad and began writing again. Not the carefully crafted message he had initially planned, but something simpler, more direct, more honest. Dear Lakewood family, he wrote, yesterday something unexpected happened in our service. Something authentic broke through the performance. I felt it. Many of you felt it too. I'm still processing what it means. But I know this. It's changing me. And it's going to change how we approach worship together. He paused, considering how much to reveal, how vulnerable to be. In the past, every communication had been vetted by a team, polished for maximum inspirational impact. But that approach suddenly felt hollow, a betrayal of the authenticity he had glimpsed for years. He continued writing, I've focused on the positive aspects of faith, on victory, prosperity, overcoming obstacles. I still believe in hope, but yesterday reminded me that faith is also about humility, about questions as well as answers, about silence as well as declaration. Moving forward, I want to explore what it means to live a faith that's authentic rather than just inspiring. A faith that acknowledges doubt as well as certainty, struggle as well as triumph. The words came more easily now, flowing from a place of genuine reflection rather than performance. Joel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the vulnerability and excitement of not knowing exactly where this path would lead, but feeling called to follow it anyway. As the day progressed, toward evening, the various threads of experience began to weave together into a tapestry of meaning. Maria completed her nursing shift the first day since. Miguel's death that didn't feel like simply going through the motions. She had been present for her patients in a new way. Listening more deeply, David finalized the footage from Sunday's service. Resisting the temptation to edit out the uncomfortable moments or enhance the emotional impact. He left it raw, authentic, a document of something real rather than something produced. Joel continued working on his message to the congregation, finding words for an experience that had largely transcended language. The process was challenging, but somehow freeing, writing not as the man with all the answers, but as a fellow seeker asking important questions. As dusk fell over Houston, these separate journeys continued. Each person changed in subtle but significant ways by what they had witnessed. The transformation wasn't dramatic or instantaneous. Real change rarely is, but something had shifted in the spiritual landscape. A reminder that faith at its most powerful isn't about spectacle or performance, but about authenticity and presence. In Maria's apartment, as she prepared a simple dinner, her phone chimed with a notification. Joel Osteen had posted a message to the Lakewood congregation. Curious, she opened it and began. To read the message was unlike Joel's usual communications. No promises of prosperity or victory, no polished platitudes about best life now. Instead, It was thoughtful, questioning, humble. It acknowledged the profound impact of Sunday's service and outlined some changes coming to Lakewood. More silence, less spectacle, more substance, less performance, more authentic conversation, less rehearsed presentation. Yesterday, Joel wrote, Chuck Norris reminded us all what faith looks like when stripped of performance. He showed us that true strength lies not in forceful words, but in humble presence. As we move forward together, I want to explore what it means to live that kind of faith, not just talk about it. Maria finished reading, a small smile touching her lips. She couldn't help but think of Miguel, how his quiet faith had been lived rather than proclaimed. Perhaps that was the revelation she needed. Not answers to why he was gone, but recognition of how he had lived. She placed her phone down and moved to the window. Looking out at the city lights coming on against the darkening sky, the grief was still there. It would always be part of her now, but alongside it, something else had begun to grow. A quiet certainty that faith could be found in silence, as well as in celebration. In questions as well as in answers, in humility as well as in confidence. What had happened at Lakewood wasn't just about Joel Osteen or Chuck Norris. It wasn't just about spectacle versus authenticity. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful statements are made without words. That in a world of constant noise and performance, silence can speak louder than any sermon. Maria touched the wedding ring hanging around her neck, feeling a connection to Miguel that transcended words. In that moment of quiet recognition, she understood what Chuck Norris had demonstrated and what Joel Osteen was beginning to learn. That true faith doesn't need to prove itself. It reveals itself. Not through grandiose declarations or elaborate productions, but through the simple, profound power of authentic presence. Outside the city continued its rhythm, lives intersecting, stories unfolding, journeys continuing and in countless ways. Both seen and unseen, the quiet revelation continued to spread that sometimes the loudest message is the one left unspoken. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.